"Shut your mouth, boy. You and your mama look like you just crawled out of the gutter." The judge's voice thundered through the packed courtroom, slicing through the tense air like a blade. Gasps erupted from the gallery, a mix of shock and unease rippling through the onlookers. In the heart of a bustling city courthouse, 17-year-old Jamal Thompson stood defiant beside his mother, Elena, their worn-out clothes a stark contrast to the polished wood and gleaming marble around them. Jamal's dark skin glistened under the harsh fluorescent lights, his sharp eyes burning with a quiet intensity, though he remained silent. His mother, Elena, clutched her tattered purse, her face a mask of resilience despite the sting of the judge's words. They were there on a minor charge, Elena accused of shoplifting groceries from a local store to feed her family after losing her job at the factory. The judge, Harlan Whitaker, a stern, silver-haired man with a reputation for harsh rulings, leaned forward from his elevated bench, his sneer deepening. "People like you think the law doesn't apply," he mocked, his voice dripping with venom and prejudice. The audience murmured, some nodded in agreement, their biases mirroring the judge's, while others shifted uncomfortably, sensing the injustice. Little did anyone know, Jamal wasn't just a scared teenager caught in a courtroom drama. He was a prodigy in disguise, a legal genius who had been studying the law in secret. The air was thick with tension as Judge Whitaker's words hung like a revelation that would leave everyone stunned. Elena's hands trembled slightly, but she held her head high, refusing to let the judge's cruelty break her. She had faced worse, years of scraping by, raising Jamal alone in a neighborhood where hope was as scarce as money. Jamal, though, was her pride. He was always different, always reading, always asking questions about justice and fairness. What she didn't know was that her son had been hiding an extraordinary secret. At 13, he discovered online law courses, devouring them late at night on a borrowed laptop. By 16, he'd passed the bar exam through a special program for gifted youth, becoming one of the youngest licensed attorneys in the state. But he kept it hidden, not out of shame, but to surprise his mother with a future free from struggle. Today, they were in court because Elena couldn't afford a lawyer, and Jamal had insisted on coming, pretending to be just her emotional support. As the judge's insults grew sharper, Jamal's mind raced, cataloging every word, every legal misstep. He knew Whitaker's history, decades of biased rulings, especially against people who looked like him and his mother. The courtroom, with its high ceilings and stern portraits of past judges, felt like a battlefield, and Jamal was ready to fight. The prosecutor, a smug man in a crisp suit, began laying out the case, painting Elena as a habitual thief. "This woman has no respect for property or law," he declared, gesturing toward the grainy security footage of Elena in the store. The judge nodded approvingly, his gavel twitching in his hand. "Anything to say, Mrs. Thompson?" Whitaker barked, his tone mocking. Elena tried to speak, her voice soft but firm. "Your Honor, I was desperate. My son needed food, medicine." Her voice cracked, and she glanced at Jamal, who gave her a reassuring nod. The judge caught their exchange and laughed cruelly. "Whispering conspiracies now? Sit down, kid, before I hold you in contempt." The bailiff smirked, and a few spectators chuckled, their prejudice emboldened by the judge's authority. But Jamal's heart pounded with purpose. He had studied Whitaker's rulings, cross-referenced legal precedents, and memorized the ethical codes that govern judicial conduct. In his backpack, he carried a folder, his trump card, filled with his bar certification and meticulously prepared notes. As the mockery reached its peak, Jamal stood, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Your Honor, I object." The courtroom froze. Whitaker's eyes narrowed. "You object? This isn't a playground, boy." But Jamal's gaze didn't waver. He opened the folder, revealing his credentials. "I am Jamal Thompson, licensed attorney, and I'm representing my mother." The room erupted in whispers. The judge's face flushed with disbelief, then fury. What followed was a masterclass in legal brilliance, Jamal dismantling the case, exposing the judge's bias, and citing laws with surgical precision. The truth exploded like a bombshell. The mock teenager was a genius, and this Jamal Thompson had always been a spark in the darkness of his rough neighborhood, where crumbling buildings and flickering streetlights told stories of struggle. Growing up in a place where dreams often withered, he devoured books like they were candy, each page a lifeline to a bigger world. By age 10, he was solving complex math problems that stumped his teachers, scribbling equations on scraps of paper under the dim glow of a second-hand lamp. His mind was a furnace, burning with curiosity and ambition. By 13, while his peers chased fleeting thrills, Jamal discovered online law courses, sneaking late-night study sessions on a borrowed laptop from the community center. He aced every module, his hunger for justice fueled by the injustices he saw daily, families like his judged by their clothes, their skin, their address. His mother, Elena, a single parent juggling 2 low-paying jobs, had no idea her son was more than a quiet, studious boy. She didn't know he had passed the bar exam at 16 through a special program for gifted youth, making him one of the youngest licensed attorneys in the state. Jamal kept it hidden, not out of fear, but as a gift he was crafting in secret, a surprise to lift his mother from the weight of the world's judgments and prove they could rise above. Elena was his hero. She worked grueling shifts as a cleaner and a cashier, her hands calloused, her smile weary but warm. She'd sacrificed everything to keep food on the table, often skipping meals so Jamal could eat. When she lost her factory job due to layoffs, the family's fragile stability crumbled. A desperate attempt to take groceries from a store, items she planned to pay for later, landed her in court, accused of shoplifting. Unable to afford a lawyer, Elena faced the hearing alone, or so she thought. Jamal insisted on coming, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his eyes steady with purpose. He told her he'd be her support, letting her believe he meant emotional strength. In truth, he was ready to unleash his secret. As they entered the courthouse, its towering columns and polished floors felt like a world built to intimidate people like them. Elena's worn coat and Jamal's faded hoodie drew stares, but he walked with quiet confidence, his mind racing through legal strategies he'd memorized like lyrics. Inside the courtroom, the air was heavy with tension. The prosecutor, a wiry man with a smug grin, laid out the case with ruthless precision, painting Elena as a habitual thief. "This woman has no regard for the law," he declared, pointing to grainy security footage of Elena in the store, her hands fumbling with a loaf of bread and canned goods. The evidence looked damning, but Jamal saw through it. He'd studied the store's history, its owner's pattern of targeting poor customers. Elena sat quietly, her hands clasped tightly, her heart breaking under the weight of shame. Jamal leaned close, his voice a whisper. "Mom, trust me. I've got this." She nodded, tears brimming, assuming he meant to comfort her. She had no idea her son was a legal prodigy, his mind a vault of case law and precedent, ready to turn the trial on its head. Judge Harlan Whitaker, perched high on his bench, caught their exchange and pounced. His cruel laugh echoed through the room. "Whispering conspiracies now? Sit down, kid, before I hold you in contempt." The words were a whip, laced with disdain. The room tensed, spectators leaning forward, some smirking at the judge's mockery. The bailiff's lips twitched with amusement, and the prosecutor's eyes gleamed, sensing an easy win. Elena's shoulders slumped, but Jamal's heart raced with purpose, not fear. He stayed calm, his plan crystallizing. He'd studied Whitaker's rulings, decades of bias against people who looked like him and his mother, rulings that favored the powerful. In his backpack was a folder, his secret weapon, his bar certification, legal notes, and a strategy to expose the judge's prejudice. He waited, patient as a chess master, for the perfect moment to reveal his genius. The courtroom, with its stern portraits and ticking clock, was about to witness a reckoning, a 17-year-old ready to rewrite the narrative and prove that brilliance could hide in the most unlikely places. The trial dragged on, each moment stretching like a taut wire in the cavernous courtroom, where Judge Harlan Whitaker's bias burned brighter than the ornate chandelier casting golden light across the polished benches. His stern gaze fixed on Elena Thompson, a single mother whose weary eyes and threadbare clothes marked her as an easy target in his eyes. "Mrs. Thompson, explain why a woman like you, unemployed, uneducated, thinks she can steal from hard-working folks," he barked, his voice sharp with condescension. The words landed like blows, each one laced with assumptions about her worth, her life, her very existence. Elena, her hands trembling in her lap, stammered, her voice quivering but resolute. "Your Honor, I was desperate. My son, he's sick, needs medicine." It was a white lie, born not of deceit but of pride, a shield to protect the raw truth of their poverty after she lost her factory job. The judge's lips curled into a sneer, unconvinced, his fingers drumming impatiently on the bench. He turned his scorn to Jamal, her 17-year-old son standing beside her, his faded hoodie and steady gaze a quiet defiance against the room's hostility. "And you, boy? Got anything to say, or are you too busy dreaming of handouts?" Whitaker spat, his tone dripping with racism and disdain. Snickers rippled through the spectators, some nodding in cruel agreement, their biases emboldened by the judge's authority, while others shifted uncomfortably, sensing the line being crossed. The prosecutor, a wiry man in a tailored suit, leaned back with a smug smirk, relishing the judge's performance as it bolstered his flimsy case. The bailiff, stationed near the door, let out a low chuckle, his eyes glinting with amusement. Elena buried her face in her hands, her shoulders hunching as if to shield herself from the weight of the room's judgment. The air was thick with tension, the courtroom a theater of prejudice where Elena and Jamal were cast as villains in a script they didn't write. But Jamal stood tall, his heart pounding not with fear but with purpose. His voice, steady and clear, cut through the mockery. "Your Honor, may I speak on behalf of my mother?" The words hung in the air, bold and unexpected. The judge's laughter erupted, a harsh, guttural sound that echoed off the high ceilings. "Speak? You? This isn't a playground, son. Go back to school, maybe learn not to end up like her." The gallery buzzed with stifled laughter, the prosecutor's smirk widening, the bailiff's chuckle growing louder. The humiliation was meant to crush, to silence, but Jamal's mind was a whirlwind of legal strategies, each one honed through years of secret study. Jamal had spent countless nights poring over law books, dissecting cases, and memorizing statutes on a borrowed laptop in their cramped apartment. He'd studied Judge Whitaker's record meticulously, decades of rulings that skewed against the poor, the marginalized, the people who looked like him and his mother. Whitaker's biases were well documented, from dismissing valid defenses to imposing harsh penalties on minor offenses, often with a sneer that matched his words today. Jamal knew the judge's weak points, a reliance on outdated precedents and a disregard for ethical codes. As the mockery reached its peak, the room feeding off Whitaker's cruelty, Jamal's hand moved to his backpack. He pulled out a worn folder, his secret weapon, containing his bar certification and pages of meticulously prepared notes. His pulse quickened, but his expression remained calm, almost serene. He'd waited for this moment, planned it, dreamed it. The courtroom, with its stern portraits of past judges and the faint ticking of a wall clock, was a battlefield, and Jamal was ready to strike. "Your Honor," he began again, his voice now edged with a quiet authority that made the Snickers falter. The judge's eyes narrowed, sensing a shift but too arrogant to believe it. Jamal's folder held more than paper, it held the truth of his genius, earned through years of defying the odds. He'd passed the bar at 16 through a prodigy program, a fact he'd kept hidden to surprise his mother and protect their dignity. Now, as the room's laughter faded into uneasy murmurs, Jamal prepared to turn the tables. The judge's bias, the prosecutor's overconfidence, the spectator's prejudice, they were all about to face a reckoning from a 17-year-old who'd been underestimated one time too many. Your Honor, Jamal Thompson declared, his voice cutting through the courtroom's heavy air with a confidence that seemed to shift the very atmosphere, I object to this entire proceeding on grounds of judicial misconduct. The words landed like a thunderclap, silencing the murmurs and snickers that had filled the room moments before. The packed gallery froze, eyes darting to the 17-year-old in the faded hoodie who stood beside his mother, Elena. Judge Harlan Whitaker's eyes widened, his weathered face a mask of disbelief and indignation. What? Who do you think you are? He barked, leaning forward, his gavel trembling in his grip. Jamal, unfazed, reached into his worn backpack and pulled out a folder, his movements deliberate, almost theatrical. He opened it with a steady hand, revealing a crisp document that gleamed under the courtroom's chandelier, his bar certification. I am Jamal Thompson, licensed attorney at law, admitted to the bar at age 16 through the state's Prodigy program. And I am representing my mother. Gasps erupted like thunder rolling through the room, a wave of shock rippling from the front pews to the back. The judge's face flushed beet red, his jaw tightening as if he'd been slapped. This is preposterous. You're just a kid, he sputtered, his voice cracking with a mix of fury and embarrassment. But Jamal stood taller, his eyes blazing with the fire of someone who'd been underestimated for far too long. The courtroom, with its towering ceilings and stern portraits of past judges, felt like it was holding its breath. Spectators leaned forward, some clutching their bags, others whispering in disbelief. The prosecutor, a wiry man who'd been smirking moments earlier, fumbled with his papers, his confidence crumbling. The bailiff's amused grin vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed stare. Elena, sitting beside Jamal, lifted her tear-streaked face, her eyes wide with confusion and dawning pride. She had no idea her son, the quiet boy who read books by flashlight, was a legal prodigy. Jamal didn't stop to savor the shock. He launched into his defense with the precision of a seasoned attorney. Under State v. Ramirez, 2018, prejudice from the bench invalidates the trial, he said, his voice steady and resonant. Your comments about our appearance and background violate Judicial Ethical Codes 3.1 and 5.2, which mandate impartiality and prohibit bias based on race or socioeconomic status. Each word was a dart. The prosecutor scrambled to counter. The judges earlier about the security footage that allegedly showed Elena shoplifting, mocking their poverty. But Jamal now was ready, like a noose his mind a steel trap of legal knowledge honed through years of secret study. Whitaker stammered, his face now a mix of rage and humiliation, he declared, gesturing to the grainy video projected on the courtroom screen. He muttered, it shows my mother placing items back on the shelf. Jamal's she never left the store with him, unyielding. Intent to steal ignorance isn't an excuse. State versus Jenkins, 2020. Just like desperation isn't a crime. Letting the precedent sink in. The words were a mic then drop, delivered the reverberating through the courtroom. Furthermore, the revelation owner like has a documented history of racial profiling, dismissed as evidence by three was prior lawsuits. Outsmarting Carter everyone. V. Green's Market, spectators began to murmur. Lopez v. some pulling Green's out phones to record, 2021, sensing history and Thomas unfolding. V. Green's Market, the prosecutor slumped in his seat, his this case is unraveling, Your Honor. And your Elena's tears turned to awe as she realized her son's secret. The room erupted years of late-night study, some turning to cheers the bar at 16, where a few supporters preparing for this very moment, their voices rising in defiance of the judge's Jamal's authority. Folder, still open, held more than his certification. It held their dignity, reclaimed in a courtroom that had tried to strip it away. The tide had turned, and the boy in the hoodie was now the one commanding the room, proving genius could rise from the shadows of prejudice. In the end, the case against Elena Thompson collapsed under the weight of Jamal's brilliance. The judge's gavel fell silent as he dismissed the charges, his voice barely a whisper, drowned out by the uproar in the courtroom. Judge Harlan Whitaker, his face still flushed with humiliation, recused himself from the bench amid a chorus of calls for an investigation into his conduct. The spectators, once divided between sneers and sympathy, now buzzed with awe, their whispers turning into a cacophony of excitement. Some clapped, others recorded the scene on their phones, capturing the moment a 17-year-old in a faded hoodie turned a biased courtroom upside down. As Jamal and Elena gathered their belongings, the weight of the victory settled over them. They stepped out of the courthouse into the golden light of late afternoon, the city's hustle a stark contrast to the stifling prejudice they'd just faced. Elena stopped on the marble steps, turning to her son with tears streaming down her face. She pulled him into a tight hug, her voice trembling with disbelief and pride. "My boy, a lawyer? How? When?" Jamal's smile was soft but radiant, his eyes gleaming with the fire of someone who'd carried a secret for years. "For us, Mom. To fight back," he said simply, his words carrying the weight of their shared struggles. Elena's heart swelled, her sacrifices, nights without sleep, meals skipped to feed him, now illuminated by the truth of her son's genius. The story of that day spread like wildfire, igniting headlines across the city and beyond. News outlets dubbed it the genius in disguise, with reporters clamoring to interview the teenage prodigy who'd outwitted a veteran judge. Local channels replayed grainy courtroom footage, showing Jamal's calm delivery of case law and his unflinching takedown of the store owner's racial profiling. Social media exploded, with hashtags like #JusticeForJamal trending as people shared clips of his speech. "Ignorance isn't an excuse, Your Honor. Just like desperation isn't a crime." The public was captivated, not just by his legal prowess but by his story, a black teenager from a rough neighborhood, raised by a single mother, who'd passed the bar at 16 through a prodigy program. Jamal became a symbol of hope, a beacon for those who'd been judged by their appearance or circumstances. He didn't shy away from the spotlight. In his first interview, standing outside the courthouse with Elena by his side, he spoke with the same clarity he'd shown in court. "Never judge by looks," he told reporters, his voice steady but passionate. "Genius hides in the most unexpected places." Inspired by the ordeal, Jamal channeled his newfound platform into action. Within months, he founded a free legal clinic for low-income families, operating out of a small community center in his neighborhood. The clinic became a lifeline, offering representation to those who, like Elena, couldn't afford a lawyer. Volunteers, law students and local attorneys inspired by Jamal's story, flocked to help. The clinic's walls, once peeling and bare, were soon covered with thank-you letters from families whose lives had been changed. Jamal worked tirelessly, balancing his studies and cases, driven by the memory of his mother's tearful pride and the courtroom's stinging prejudice. His story didn't fade, it grew. National media picked it up, and soon, Jamal was invited to speak at legal conferences, his youth and eloquence drawing standing ovations. Years later, at just 25, he argued a landmark case before the Supreme Court, challenging systemic bias in the justice system. The justices, initially skeptical of the young attorney, were left speechless by his command of the law, a direct echo of that fateful day in Whitaker's courtroom. For Jamal, that day remained a touchstone. It taught him, and the world, that true justice sees beyond color, clothes, or cruelty. Elena, now working a stable job and living in a modest but comfortable home, watched her son soar with a pride that no words could capture. She attended every major milestone, from the clinic's opening to his Supreme Court appearance, her eyes always brimming with tears of joy. In a world rife with biases, one teen's secret had sparked a movement, proving that brilliance could rewrite even the cruelest narratives. What a twist, a boy once mocked as a nobody had become a force for change, his name synonymous with justice.